Hello, I'm Anthony. Today we're going to talk about the wonderful world of sequences. A sequence is basically a set of notes that's designed to cycle or repeat periodically, and many synthesizers have the ability to do this as part of their makeup. What we're going to listen to today is an excerpt from a piece of music that I'm writing. I've got these three sequences that I'm going to play to you, and then we're going to deconstruct them and have a look at how each of the sequences is built differently and how each of them contributes to the whole. So firstly, let's just have a listen to it. The unique section of this sequence extends over 2 bars. So here's 2 bars worth of it. Okay, that beautiful sound is being generated. I'm not taking credit for the beauty of the sound. That's the Roland Juno 6 and the Yamaha CS80. Both emulations are by Arturia, and they're both mighty, mighty instruments. Let's start with the Juno first. This is the simplest of the 3 sequences. The Juno doesn't have a sequencer built into it, so we're going to have to do this by hand. If I play a note on the keyboard, this is what you're going to get. So as I say, that sequence is being built by hand. If we have a look at the pattern, there it is. So this piece of music is written in C minor, and that's going to inform a large part of what we talk about today. It's really important when I'm designing sequences that they stay in key. If I want to pull a tune out of key, I'll do it myself by hand. I'll write a melody that might stretch it somewhere. But as far as these sequences are concerned, I need to be able to let them run in the background and always be in key, and that's really important to me. So the reason we've started with the Juno is because this is the simplest of the 3 sequences. You can also see that it has a kind of bouncing, repeating pattern sort of thing. So it cycles over 2 bars, and in the middle of this section, we get to the kind of the high point, and then we fall down to low points every other bar. It's also quite a fast sequence. I'm using different paces for each of these sequences. Now, the reason why I've started here is because this is kind of principle number 1 of when you're designing sequences, the simplicity versus complexity argument. Simplicity is great from the perspective of familiarity. It induces this kind of trance state where we know what we're going to get. It's going to be the same every time, and we just kind of sink into it. That's a really important part of music composition for me, and that's why this Juno line is there, providing that anchor around which all of the other woolly stuff can kind of rotate. Now, in its own right, it's a relatively complex sequence. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different notes out of the scale. So there's only 7 notes in the key of C minor, and I'm using almost all of them. Only actually the A flat that's missing. Cubase would be representing it as a G sharp, because I've not told Cubase this is C minor, so it's notating everything as sharps. But there's an A flat that could go in there that doesn't. Kind of hold that in mind. That's interesting to look at a little bit later. So from this perspective, we've got this internally reasonably complex but stable, consistent, reliable pattern. So I'm going to put that on the simplicity shelf. This is the foundation upon which the other stuff is going to sit. Okay, we've not set the world on fire yet. Let's have a look at the next sequence. This one is a little bit more interesting. So this is coming from the CS80, and the pattern itself sounds like this. Now, the CS80 is a wonderful instrument. It's actually got essentially an arpeggiator and a sequencer built into it, and they're integrated in a very lovely way. What you're seeing on screen there is a chord that's being held down, it's being arpeggiated. But the way the CS80 is designed, we have each of these voice banks. So there are basically 8 separate voices, and you can put the instrument in rotate mode, where every note that gets played uses a different voice. Those voices in turn can be individually transposed. So if we have a look at voice number 1, for instance, that's transposed by +10 semitones, or -2 if you prefer to think about it that way. If we have a look at the scale, each one of the notes in this pattern is still in key if it's transposed up by 10 semitones. So across this entire pattern, I'm only playing C's, F's and G's, and each one of those can be transposed up by 10 semitones or down by 2. You're going to hit a B flat, that's completely fine. The F is going to turn into an E flat, that's fine. And the G is going to turn into an F, and that's also fine. So regardless of what's happening with the sequence, I know that I can play that chord on the keyboard. If I play a C and a G now, if I let that pattern run, regardless of how those notes are transposed by the CS80, they're always going to be in key. In fact, I've actually been through each of the transpose options, and anything that isn't set to 0, I've made sure that it's still legal in the context of the piece. There's a -2, there's a +3, and there's a -5. So I need to make sure that each one of those offsets is always legal, regardless of which of these notes is being played. So I hold both the C and F down. Now occasionally those voices are going to cycle around so that they play -2 or -5 or +3 off those offsets, off the C and the F offsets. Let's bring the synthesizer back in again. You can see those lights lighting up as it rotates around the voices. Can you also see that voice number 8 has been disabled? Here I'm throwing some fuel on the complexity side of the seesaw. You know, I was talking about this tension between simplicity and complexity. I think that's just a really great way to approach music writing generally. And in this particular sequence, I've veered more towards the kind of complex side of things because the sequence itself is rotating on a 7-note pattern, but the piece of music in the background is notating effectively on an 8-step pattern. What that means is that it's constantly evolving. As this set of chords is played, it's constantly going to be picking out different notes to have each one of those offsets be played at. Because we're rotating around to voice number 7 and then jumping back to number 1. Another lovely thing about this preset is that not all voices are sounding. On some sequences you'll have on and off options for each of the steps. On the CS80 it's a little simpler than that. We have volume control. So in voice number 2, for instance, you can see the volume is set to 0. So in this particular preset, any of the voices that have effectively no volume, you won't see any of their offsets being set. There's no point because you're never hearing them. What that gives is rhythmic interest. So we've got 2 different metrics there. We've got the rhythmic interest and the tonal interest from all of these different transpose options being played on a 7-note rotating basis over this AB chord pattern. So we're basically just oscillating backwards and forwards between these 2 patterns. The advantage of playing multiple Cs, by the way, so you can see that I'm playing 3 separate Cs on that chord, is because we're dealing with an arpeggiator. So it will play every one of those notes. And so kind of 3/4 of the time it's centered on the tonic. And in the second half of the pattern, 50% of the time it's centered on the tonic. Then we add the additional complexity from the transpose notes. All of that wraps up into this beautiful kind of rotating, kind of morphing, really interesting sound. Now when we bring the stability of the Juno back in and you play those 2 things side by side, we've already got multiple different metrics by which this thing is interesting. The Juno is playing twice as fast. Its step speed is twice as fast. It's completely stable. The CS80 is constantly evolving. And the CS80 is also pulling out really interesting pitches. Now, do you remember earlier when we were looking at the Juno 6 and 6 of the 7 notes were in the scale of C minor? The one that was missing was A flat. I said kind of stick it in your memory bank, we'll come back to it. This second pattern uses it, but not very often. Basically, the only way you're going to get an A flat is if the F note is sounding on the voice that's transposed up by 3 semitones. So if we have a look back at the CS80 again, there's one voice somewhere. Let's find it. There it is. So when voice number 6 is playing and there's an F pressed down, you're going to very occasionally hear an A flat. Now that's one of the more tense notes in the key of C minor. A kind of a good rule of thumb to think about in case of tension is your tonics and your perfect fifths are the most stable notes. If you have a note 1 semitone away from either of those, it's generally going to be in tension because it wants to pull back to either the tonic or the perfect fifth. In this case here we have an A flat. It wants to pull down to the G and so it's going to be under some sort of tension. You don't get any of them in the Juno pattern, but the electro does occasionally throw one in. And those are the things that you don't really individually pick. I'm not fast enough, my brain's not fast enough to pick up these things, but I do hear it, and that's the stuff that you enjoy. So I've made sure that basically these transpose offsets and the notes that are being played by the sequence underneath are just picking out these interesting tones every now and again. Just have a quick look at this to kind of consider that for a moment again. Here are your root notes, and then here are all of the different possible offsets that could be played. The notes in brackets are basically represented elsewhere, so they're kind of duplicates, but you can see all of these different unique tones being played at different times. On to the third pattern. So this is another sequence. Once again, it's played by the CS80. This is what it sounds like on its own. It's just such a gorgeous sound. What an instrument this thing is. If you haven't wrapped your head around the CS80, I've actually done a full video tutorial series on the CS80. I'll put a link to that above. So here we have the Safari Mission presets. Almost all of the presets I ever use start out as a stock preset, and then I evolve it to my own use. This asterisk is telling you that that's happened here. One of the things that I've done in particular in this preset is that I've been through each of these transpose offsets. There's only actually one interesting one. In voice number 7, I'm transposing up by 17 semitones. That's not stock, I've adjusted it. And then I've put notes in the sequence underneath to ensure that every time that offset is basically +5, because we're dealing with octaves here. Every one of these notes has to subscribe to that rule. Bring the keyboard back in. I've got C's, I've got D sharps, and I've got F's. There's an F there somewhere. Each one of those notes can be transposed up by 5 semitones, C to F, F to B flat, and E flat or D sharp, back up to A flat, the interesting and exotic A flat again. So I've made sure that each of the notes that are played in the sequence is pushing this stress note, the thing that you don't hear in your anchor sequence. The Juno isn't playing any A flats, but the two CS80 sequences are. Now then, we're not done with this second preset yet. Let's get back to it. I'm going to hold down a C and a G. So you can see the voices rotating. This time we're using all 8 voices. But can you tell there's no discernible pattern there? There's something vaguely resembling familiarity. You hear kind of repeating motifs, but then there's no stability to it. What's going on in this preset is that the arpeggiator is playing the notes back in a random sequence, but that random sequence is being repeated. So basically whatever the arpeggiator chooses, it'll do that thing twice. So if I play a C major chord, I'm just going to play C, E, G. You hear just the kind of the essence of familiarity before the arpeggiator chooses new notes and moves on to that new pattern. So it's a beautiful combination of simplicity and complexity. Once again, these two things in tension. So many different roads all lead to Rome. All of these different solutions, I've just picked on 3 different sequences here, using completely different approaches to generate that interest. So this time we've got a cycling 8-note piece. Only one of those 8 notes is anything other than an octave. All of the others are 0s or 12s or 24s or variations thereof. Voice number 7 and only voice number 7 has a variant. That's just picking out 5 semitones above the played note. But then the order in which those notes are being played, if I'm playing a chord and we're arpeggiating it, they're being randomized and it's generating the interest in that way. So when we listen to this thing, you just get these occasional spikes of interest as those plus 17s kick in. So now we've got kind of 2 sequences on the complex side of the seesaw, 1 sequence more on the simplicity side of the seesaw. Bring them all back together. hear those notes being picked out every now and again. Hope you enjoyed this video today. I think that's just a really beautiful sound. I wanted to share it with you. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.